Welcome everyone to our Wednesday Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers webinar. This is, we're getting towards the end. We're in April, so we're going to wrap up at the end of this month. But really excited to have Joshua Faulkner here from UVM Extension. He's the director of the Agriculture and Environmental Testing Soil Lab and the Center for Sustainable Agriculture, and does lots of amazing work with all things soil and water. So I'll hand it over to you, Joshua, to share your slides.
All right. So thanks, Becky, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to present on drainage, really water management in fields and hot tunnels, so, which is I think a pretty pertinent topic for everyone farming these days, given the last few seasons that we've had here in Vermont. This can be, I'm pretty poor at managing the chat as we go. So if there's something that I need to clarify, please someone just yell at me, or maybe Becky stop me and we can do it then, or we can do questions at the end. But I hope to leave, 10 to 15 minutes for that at the end. What I've done today is I've kind of divided this presentation up into two parts, and the first part will be focused on drainage in fields, and then the second part, which is a little bit shorter, will be focused on drainage in and around hot tunnels, and then I will finish with just a couple slides on some drainage approaches that are applicable to both fields and hot tunnel situations. So with that, I'll jump right in. I guess a little bit more intro. I've been at UVM for about 12 years now, this coming May, and initially came to kind of build a farming and climate change program. And it was just after Tropical Storm Irene that UVM Extension decided that we needed that kind of program, which I think my understanding is we were the first land grant in the country to have a dedicated extension program focused on climate change and agriculture. So we should be kind of proud of that. And then I came and everyone was really concerned about, how wet it was with Irene and the drainage issues, because that was also a very wet year, even preceding Irene. And then we had, actually some drier years between then and now, and 2023 felt a little bit like deja vu because of all the moisture issues we had then, and that's what I'll start with. And I think this is not new information to anyone farming in Vermont, but this really frames this webinar really well, this presentation well. That year of 2023, at least where I do a lot of my field research in Addison County, Vermont, was the wettest August or July and August period on record, and those records stretch all the way back to 1895. And these are the NOAA data for Addison County during that time period. But I had rain gauges out that recorded between 22 and 23 inches just in July and August. So of course, this was not just dealing with flooding during that year, but also just really, really wet, excessively wet growing conditions once the rain started in early July. And then of course 24, this is a photo of Joe's Brook Farm in Barnett. We had drier conditions than 23 in some parts of the state, but wetter conditions in other parts of the state. This is a storm that dropped just over 8 inches in 24 hours in the St. Johnsbury area, which just shattered the previous 24-hour record as recorded at the Fairbanks Museum and Planetarium. So again, just a couple reminders of why we're interested in dealing with water management and finding drainage solutions for our farms. I think there's more of this, these wet growing seasons in our future. But I will remind us that we are in New England. It's never been an ideal place to farm. This is a quote from the Ag Experiment Station, Vermont Ag Experiment Station of 1912, and I'll let you read that. But this has always been a challenging place to grow because of moisture, and to some extent because of heavy soils in some parts of the state. So farmers were not the first ones to deal with these issues, although the intensity and magnitude of it may be greater than it was back in 1912 when this phrase was coined. Okay, so what can we do to deal with saturated soils in fields? And I do a lot of answer a lot of technical assistance calls on drainage, and tile is always kind of one of these things that inevitably comes up in the conversation. And I'll say this is possibly the best solution in some instances, but it's not always the best solution. There are other perhaps more targeted or better, bang for the buck solutions. And hopefully I'll be able to address some of those at the end, and we can talk about that. But we really, I think, need to start with this a discussion around tile drainage. And for those of you who this is a new concept to, tile drainage, it's called tile because it used to be made literally of terracotta clay pipes or horseshoe shaped kind of sections that were placed in the soil beneath the root zone of a crop, and they're designed to lower the water table. Essentially, this idea of artificially lowering the water table is not new, stretches all the way back to 200 BC. Nowadays, what we call tile is really plastic corrugated perforated pipe. It's really the same type of pipe that you see that goes in around footer drains when someone's building a house. It's often in coils, and it's placed with different types of equipment, typically at a 3 to 3.5 foot depth, but that can vary. One of the questions that inevitably comes up is, well, I'm interested in draining my fields, but I don't want to over drain. I don't want to remove water that would be available to crops when we inevitably have that dry July or August period later on in the summer. And that's really not the case. What tile does, it removes what we call free water, or water that can be removed via the forces of gravity. And a good way to kind of demonstrate this is if you think about a sponge, and you put that sponge in a bucket of water and you fully saturate it, and then you pull it up out of that bucket of water, and you don't squeeze it, you just hold it. All the water that runs out of that sponge without you squeezing it, that's the free water. That's water that's removed just via gravity. And that's the water that the tile drains would remove from your soil. The water that's left in that sponge is the water that's available for crops. That's kind of referred to as your available water capacity, what was held after that free water drains. And so if you kind of, take this analogy a step further, if you squeeze that sponge and squeeze more water out of it, that's analogous to the what plants would do to that sponge, how they would, your hands squeezing it would be the action of the plants removing water from the crops. So drainage has two kind of primary benefits. We'll talk about a couple other minor benefits, but really it of course it improves crop production. Most of the data we have on its ability to improve crop production is in field crops. It's very hard to find this for specialty crops, for vegetable and fruit crops, but of course it functions the same way in those types of crops as well. One way of thinking about this is it helps get a farm off of a roller coaster of really poor years and really good years, and kind of levels out production. That's often how it's, because it maintains consistent yields year over year, as long as there's adequate water and other crop inputs like fertility. And then the second benefit of drainage is it improves trafficability. And in many ways, this can be as important as that literally lowering water out of the root zone and preventing, damage to crops from saturated roots, because it allows farmers to do what they need to do when they need to do it, whether that's in the spring or midsummer or in the fall. It just those trafficability benefits often translate directly to improved yield. So they shouldn't be ignored. And then I have some yield data there from drainage studies, if you're interested. These are one is from Ontario, so tried to pick data from close to Vermont as I could find, and then the other is just from the longest running drainage study that I'm aware of. And again, I apologize; these are all field crops, but it's hard to find this for vegetable crops. Another minor benefit, I guess I'd say minor, but it depends how you look at this and what your soil textures are on your farm, but it also, drainage can help reduce compaction. And really just the way it functions to do that is it reduces soil moisture. And we know that bearing pressures from heavy equipment travel deeper into soils when that soil is moist. So if we can keep that soil drier, we can avoid those pressures compacting soils to some degree, and especially preventing some of the deeper compaction, which is the most difficult to remediate down below the typical plow layer. And there's just a kind of a classic ag engineering figure there on your right that shows how those bearing pressures travel deeper in the soils when the soils are moist. Drainage also maybe a little counterintuitively helps in the dry years. We of course would expect it to help in the wet years, but it functions in the dry years to keep the water table low in the early part of the growing season. So when crops are establishing their root system, they're not inhibited by a high water table. So those roots go deeper in the early season, so that later on in the late summer, when we do have drier conditions, those roots are deep enough that they can potentially access that the deeper water table, and much improved production versus a shallow root system, of course, if that was in an undrained system. There's various ways of kind of doing drainage, if you will, with tile. There's modern systems are typically very pattern-like and systematic in their implementation. You can have parallel systems, you can have herringbone systems, double main systems with a ditch running through the middle of the field. All these different ways of doing drainage are common in both field crop and vegetable systems. We also see a lot of random. If you kind of look at the schematics on the left-hand side of your screen, the lower right is a random drainage system, and this is common in areas where there's kind of a fair amount of topography in the farm fields, where you have distinct high areas and low areas within a field. Often you'll see these random or kind of erratic tile lines that just hit these depressional areas and drain those areas, and that can be very effective too. You don't necessarily need a pattern system if you just have a few problematic areas within your field. Tile spacing. This is there's several design parameters that are considered with a tile installation, but spacing is probably has the largest implications both for effectiveness and for cost. So there's a lot of, I think, important decision making that goes into deciding what the spacing of your tile will be. And I guess I'll just start here on the right-hand side of your screen. You see correctly spaced tile, and then incorrectly, tile spaced too far apart, where you see the dashed lines representing the water table after a storm. And really, the goal is to lower the water table below the root zone of a crop within 24 hours. And if tiles are spaced too widely, you won't achieve that at the center point between the tile lines. And so you'll often see that, especially in field crops, you'll see that in a crop, you kind of what I call the wave, where you see actually the low point is the center point between the tiles, and where the corn is really short, and then the corn is the tallest directly over the tile. So we're trying to avoid that, if at all possible. So how do we determine what that spacing should be? There is an NRCS drainage guide. I don't believe it's still being published by NRCS Vermont, but other states have these drainage guides. But they provide, I do have a copy of this if anyone's interested. These do provide some guidance on what drainage spacing should be, based upon the various soils in the state. You can also do a calculation based upon the soil texture. Both of these approaches are fine, but what I think is maybe most realistic and most effective is to have conversations with farmers in your area, farming on very similar soils, or extension folks who have experience, or can gather information from other farmers, and also to some extent talk to contractors. It's good to be aware contractors, of course, have the closer you put your tile, the more expensive it is. So there's potential for maybe more profit from a contractor's perspective. So at least take that with a grain of salt. But I think a lot of contractors are fair on this, and are good to have a conversation and get a recommendation from. But I think this is really the best approach in this day and age, is to determine spacing. And then, of course, considering your financials, because there is a big difference between a 50-foot spacing and a 25-foot spacing. I mean, it could potentially double the cost. So you need to consider what degree of yield loss are you willing to withstand. Do you own this land, or do you just rent this land? How much are you willing to invest in it? What is the optimum? What is the yield in an ideal year? And what is the difference between that and a year where you have drainage issues, where they become very obvious in your yield? You can do an economic analysis to help determine that as well. Just another really helpful figure on tile depths and spacing, and how these function to influence water table depths and drainage rates within the soil. Really, spacing controls, this is the primary thing it controls. It controls the time it takes to lower that water table below the root zone, so that the tighter the spacing, the more quickly we lower the water table. And then the depth is important for a couple of different reasons. One, it controls the final water table elevation. And it controls the total volume of water drained. And that makes sense if you think all the water above the drainage tile would, in a perfect scenario, exits the field through the tile lines. So if we have a deeper tile, we have more water that would be drained. The final water table elevation is important, depending on the texture of your soil. I think we all kind of intuitively understand that if we have a sandy soil, the water table really isn't wicked up above that water table elevation of sandy soil very far, what we call capillary rise, because the pore space in the sands are so large. But in a clay, there's quite a bit of capillary rise. If you have your water table is 3 feet below the surface of the soil, in theory, capillary rise in clays can be up to 3 feet. So you could see moisture that is wicked upward in clays all the way to the surface of the soil. And so typically in a finer textured soil, we might think about putting that tile a little deeper to avoid any influence of that capillary rise. So another important consideration. This is a figure from 2023, and from a farm I work with in Addison County, and I use it to kind of show a couple different things. This is a corn silage and a field that has tile drainage in it. And they also have a yield monitor where you can see areas of high yield are in green, and dark green are the highest yielding, and then areas in red are lower yielding. And I think this, kind of makes 2 points. One, if you look at the left end of the field in that depressional area where it's very red. There are instances, tile is not, it's not necessarily this silver bullet for all drainage issues. When it is really wet, tile cannot keep up. So there are still going to be, potentially in years like 2023, especially in heavy soils, there are going to be areas of lower yielding crops, even if it is artificially drained. And the other thing I like to show, but then, vice versa, you look at the far right end and yields are look very good. 21 tons to the acre in corn silage on these heavy clays is very good. So tile was working well in that higher end of the field. But then in between those, we really see the influence of spacing. Kind of, if you look as you work left to right on the lower half of the field, you see those green striations. Those are literally where the tile lines are located and where we see the highest yield. We just see the influence of spacing there. And this is a great instance of where potentially tighter spacing could have led to more green on this, and you would not have seen that variation between the yellows and the oranges and the green near as much. Just a great, I think, visual that shows the influence of spacing. This is a field where you would have seen that wave that I discussed earlier, the different heights of the crops as you look across the field, parallel to the tile lines. This is another figure on spacing that I use a lot. This is from Larry Gehring, Cornell's old drainage extension specialist, and I like this because it shows kind of economic considerations around spacing, and that there's, if you put your tile really close together, super close together, it's going to be very expensive, and you're not going to realize the profit from that, any profit from that. And then vice versa, if you space it really far apart, the same situation, you don't realize the profit. So there's this optimum spacing for every soil, and we don't necessarily know what that is for all soils, and that's why I think it's really good to kind of get closer to that answer through talking with other farmers or folks who have experience in Vermont in our soils. Another issue, and this is becoming, I hear more and more conversation about this, is the use of sediment socks on tiles, or using sand slot pipes. And so there's quite a bit of discussion about this right now, and there's some great work from Eson Gain at Michigan State University. If you're ever curious, I can send you a link, or you can just look at Michigan State extension site on tile drainage, and he does a lot of work with these kind of different approaches to keeping sediment out of tile lines. In general, sediment control is needed if we have sands, loamy sands, sandy loams, loams, silt loams, and silts. It's especially true if the soil has a fair amount of fine silts or very fine sands, and that's really, these are particles that can migrate in the subsurface and migrate into tile lines as drainage water moves into those tile lines. And then if the tile line doesn't have adequate slope, the water doesn't move quick enough through that tile line, carry enough energy, then that sediment, those silt and sand particles, can settle out in the tile line and eventually clog the tile line. So some approach in certain soils is necessary to protect that investment and prevent clogging. These are not needed in our heavy clay soils. So that's really important for some of our folks growing field crops. Socks and sand slot pipe. So sand slot pipe just has slots that the perforations are a bit narrower to prevent the entrance of those soil particles. Both of these approaches work, but socks really function to increase the water flow versus that sand slot pipe. And it's a little bit hard to visualize, but you kind of think of this sock over the pipe surface. That's the interface between the soil and the pipe becomes the sock, not these little sand slot, all these individual sand slots. So you get this much larger surface area where water can infiltrate into the void where the pipe is located. And of course, this could potentially have implications if you have higher flow rates, then you might be able to have wider field spacing of your pipes and a lower investment cost. The other factor here is that the higher the number of slots in a pipe, the higher the water flow. So if you'll look at the way they spec out drainage pipe, you'll see, for example, 8-row pipe or 4-row pipe. So those have different numbers of perforations around the circumference of a pipe. And so the number of slots is much more important than the width of the slots. So if you're kind of decided to go with a sand slot pipe versus a sediment sock, then if you do go with a sand slot pipe, you want to go with the higher number of slots, the 8-row versus the 4-row, for example. And this is a nice figure that shows the difference in drainage inflow rates between a sock wrapped pipe, an 8-row sand slot pipe, and a 4-row sand slot pipe. So, it doesn't look like that big of a difference here, but across the area of a field, these flow rates are important. They're meaningful. As far as installing tile drainage, it's really, there are 3-point hitch equipment out there. Professional tile drainage contractors use equipment more like what I'm showing in the top right hand corner of your screen, kind of a machine on tracks with a large shank on the back and the spool of tile that actually mounts right to the equipment. The important thing here, I think, is to ask your contractor about using RTK, real-time kinematic GPS technology. That ensures that tile is laid on a consistent grade or slope across the field. You can certainly achieve consistent slopes with laser levels with an old school backhoe and excavating trenches, but really for modern systems that move much faster, you need this kind of technology to make sure you hold grade. It's important you don't have dips and swags within your tile lines. It kind of, if you think about that intuitively, you think, well, the water will still drain even though there's a dip, there's still a slope, but those dips are where we see sediment gather if sediment does get in the pipe. So that's where we start to see clogging if we don't have a consistent grade across the field. It's just like a P-trap in your sink drain, in your kitchen. You have that dip. That's where the solids gather, and they can eventually clog the tile line. Okay, so yeah, RTK technology, good for bigger jobs, may not be necessary for some of those. Like I said, if you're just trying to hit those depressional areas within a field, you might not need this kind of technology. This would be for more of those systematic or pattern systems. What I really like about this is that they produce a nice map when they're complete. So you'll have the map of your field and you'll know exactly where your tile lines are placed with this type of GPS technology, so that if you ever do have issues or say you need to put an electrical line across your field for one reason or another, something like that, where your tile lines are located, and that's really helpful. And then the last thing I'll say on installation, I think timing really does matter here. Ideally, we would do tile installation when the soils are dry, so that when we use this large shank that buries the tile, that we're also helping to fracture any compaction layers, especially deep, down around the depth where the tile is being placed. When we do that, we increase water flow then, both vertically and horizontally to the tile lines. So timing is an important consideration. I know, it's not always possible to do this when we have dry conditions, but we should strive for that if we can. Economics. So I had a couple more slides in here for field folks growing field crops, and I took them out. They don't really apply to those in the vegetable and berry kind of arena, because we have these, different bushels of corn per acre, tons of silage per acre, and I just didn't have anything analogous for vegetables. But I think it's possible to kind of think about this yourself and maybe get a rough idea of what your yield improvement might be with tile drainage. If you kind of compare it to think about the yield of a similarly managed field that is well drained, similar fertility, same production practices, so on and so forth, you can kind of get an idea and maybe pencil out a comparison yourself. Or just think about that particular field, what the yield is in an optimum weather year. And then you might get an idea of what the yield improvement and potential payback might be. Don't forget the benefit of improved trafficability. And this maybe goes without saying, is drainage truly the yield limiter here, or are there other things that need to be addressed? And then is drainage a problem on a regular basis? No one knows the answer to that question, but certainly our climate change projections indicate that we're going to continue to get wetter and see these challenging growing seasons because of excess moisture. Regulatory issues are important to consider when we talk about tile. And this applies to both USDA programs and EPA, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have regulations on this too. I find it best that if there's a questionable area of a field, someplace, an area of a field that potentially, or a new area that you want to bring into production, those are really where the questions come up, and it's really advisable to talk to USDA to do a wetland delineation before draining something that is you think might be at risk of triggering one of these regulatory concerns from a federal agency. And it's I think a conversation with your NRCS, and if something generally has been in production since 1980, it's not a concern. But if it's really, we're talking about here new areas of bringing new areas into production is where we have the most concern with these. Okay, and we can't really talk about tile drainage without talking about some of the environmental concerns. And we started to understand that phosphorus, previously we thought phosphorus all bonds tightly to soil particles and it doesn't move into subsurface, into subsurface drainage systems and with subsurface flows. But we saw that was not the case with some work done really starting in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And they saw drainage tile transporting meaningful amounts of phosphorus. And then we started to do some monitoring here in the Champlain Basin on our dairy farms, and we indeed saw phosphorus being transported in these tile lines. I haven't done any monitoring on vegetable farms, but it certainly stands to reason that we would expect to see some phosphorus transport from these farms as well, especially where soil test phosphorus is elevated. The other environmental concern is around hydrology and how tile drainage affects kind of watershed hydrology, peak flows, for example. There's been some cases in Vermont where this has been in the news, and I just want to kind of show a slide on what the scientific literature says about this. In general, we think that tile drainage serves to dampen peak flows at the watershed scale. So just showing that kind of visually on the right-hand side of your screen, where we have a hydrograph, we look at stream flow from a watershed that doesn't have any tile, and then we tile most of that watershed. We see this dampening of the peak flows because water is not all just running off the surface of the soil because the soil is saturated. We've created more dry soil for the incoming precipitation to soak into and then flow through those tile lines into our stream. So we dampen the flow. And that's even more so when we have dry soils than when we have wet soils. The other thing here is that I think important to note is that we do see more total water leaving a watershed when we have a lot of tile in it than when we don't. increases base flow in streams by 10 to 20%. And then I think it depends on your perspective whether that could be a good thing or a bad thing. So in terms of the environmental implications, it's kind of complicated. We don't know the answer to what is the net effect on phosphorus loss, because we know we decrease surface runoff when we put in tile drainage, so we decrease potentially the amount of erosion that's occurring off the surface of a field because we have more water moving through the subsurface. Certainly heard anecdotal reports of reduction in gully formation and gully erosion when a field is tiled. Improved yields in a field means more phosphorus is removed by the crop instead of remaining there in the environment subject to potential loss. And then Heather Darby's done a little bit of survey work on this, where tile drainage, because soils are drier, it increases the level of adoption of soil health best management practices, things like no-till and without leading to compaction, or being able to plant cover crops because the soil remains drier later in the fall, things like that. So again, we don't know exactly what the net effect is, but we do know it's there are pluses and minuses, and it's complicated. And then I just have a couple more slides on the environmental effects of tile. We have done some work because we know there is tile leaving a field in the subsurface when it is drained. We've done some work with some filter systems to try to capture that phosphorus. And we've installed several of these on farms, but we haven't done one on a vegetable farm yet with a tile system. These are just designed to remove dissolved phosphorus in the water. They literally act like big water filters where we divert the water right before it's discharged into the ditch beside the field through a manifold, and then it filters through media, kind of gravel media that has a certain amount of iron shavings in it, and that iron bonds, forms iron oxides and hydroxides with phosphorus and removes that phosphorus from the water. And this is currently a NRCS Vermont interim conservation practice. And just some of our data on the performance of these filter systems. We've seen, this is total phosphorus from one of our kind of star filters that's doing a really good job. You see inlet and outlet concentrations on the left and inlet and outlet phosphorus loads on the right. We've been able to remove 80% of mass of total phosphorus with one of these filters. And this was over the course of 22 storm events, so almost 2 years. And then even better results for SRP, which is our soluble form of phosphorus, soluble reactive phosphorus. Again, you see concentrations on the left and mass loads on the right. And here we've been able to remove about 95% of phosphorus. So we know there are some phosphorus loss pathways through tile systems, but there are potential solutions to address that as well. Okay, so now I'm going to transition away from field drainage and talk about drainage around high tunnels. And this is often a little more complex and often pretty fun to try to troubleshoot. I get a lot of questions on this too, and go to farms and kind of walk around production areas and look at, I think that's your first step, is really to look at where the water is coming from that is causing the problems in and around a high tunnel. Sometimes it's the literally just water coming from the roof of the high tunnel itself. Sometimes it's that barn, that old dairy barn that is, just 50 feet away from a high tunnel, but slightly upslope, and you get all that roof water that's coming off of that barn and then flowing toward the high tunnel. Sometimes it's just shallow groundwater issues. So it's a great exercise to kind of take a fresh look at your production area and look at those impervious surfaces, both under your feet and over your head, and try to figure out where is this water coming from that's causing the issue within my high tunnel. Every farm is a very unique combination of these different puzzle pieces. So there's lots to consider. And I will say, in some cases, there are some engineering, there might be some engineering expertise that would be necessary, because we are talking about some drainage networks that around kind of developed areas, your roads and your barns and your foundation. So engineering expertise might be necessary. And then potentially less so here than in field drainage. There might be some regulatory issues. I've seen this in a couple of instances where a hot tunnel is placed, say, very close to a wetland, and they want to drain around that hot tunnel. And I think that's something that might need a closer look to make sure that you're not inadvertently draining a wetland when you're removing water from along the side of your hot tunnel. So just good to be aware of that and consider that. Okay, went a little fast there. So, just a couple images. Thanks to Becky for sharing these. I think I talked to a lot of farms and about, the water issues, and some farms are putting in hot tunnels specifically to deal with, these challenging years with excess precipitation. But it doesn't mean that crops within a hot tunnel are immune to saturated soils if there's not planning and a plan in place to deal with water that can potentially enter that hot tunnel. And just some images of high water table issues in hot tunnels and what they can lead to. You can see ponded water within a hot tunnel, just like you can outside of a hot tunnel. And so I think that really the first approach, or kind of the initial approach to how you design your hot tunnel placement, if you have the luxury of this before you have hot tunnels in place, I think is, this is one of those instances where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Trying to create positive drainage away from the hot tunnel is really important. We have a lot of water coming off of that hot tunnel skin, off of that impervious surface. So we need to plan for that. There's a couple ways of doing this. One is we can build an elevated pad to put our tunnel up on. There's some disadvantages to that. Often you're moving soil that is, and you're not, you're disturbing the soil. You're potentially mixing in a lot of mineral soil when you put in that fill. So you might need to then do some work on the fertility and the soil health in this new fill soil that you've placed your tunnel upon. And then the other approach is just to do some grading away from the sides of your tunnel in that existing grade, so that you get positive drainage away from it, but placing that tunnel on existing grade. So a couple different ways of doing that. I think the other thing that I see a lot is tunnel spacing is an important consideration. As we put tunnels closer together, we restrict the ability to get heavy equipment in between those tunnels if we want to do some retro earthwork after the tunnels are in place. So just making sure we do any earthwork, building swales, perhaps forming swales in between tunnels prior to a tunnel construction, again, is well worth that planning effort, because it's challenging to fix these beforehand. And in between the tunnel, of course, you have water coming from two tunnels into that very narrow area. So you have quite a bit of moisture that you're trying to deal with. And then there are trench drains, and these can be installed under kind of, this is a drawing of a barn roof, but the idea is the same. We recommend these to folks who are trying to capture water alongside tunnel walls. And these can be installed during construction of the tunnel. They're just excavated trenches with a perforated pipe in the base and then backfilled with gravel. And these, I think, one note of caution, we want to be careful doing this on existing tunnels. You want to make sure you stay at least 18 inches away from footers on whether pylons or footer walls on hot tunnels, so you don't compromise the integrity of that foundation. But you can still do this and put this in after the fact. The nice thing about these is they capture water running off the roof of the tunnel, and they also capture any subsurface water or upslope water that would be potentially running down the hill into a high tunnel, whether it's above ground or underground. This can help act as a curtain drain to cut that water off. So I really like these. And then one thing I've seen, which creates a lot of problems, is these joint tunnels. If they don't have a very thoughtfully designed gutter system in that V where the tunnels are joined, all of that water running off of the tunnel, either side of that V, eventually comes back into one or both of those tunnels and creates drainage issues. So I don't necessarily recommend these unless there is a good gutter system there in between. And I think maybe my next to last slide here is just to pitch the importance of understanding your soils when you do any of these drainage interventions. Your soil texture definitely affects your tile drainage parameters. And then the other important thing to note here, in a lot of Vermont farms that I see, especially outside of the Champlain Valley and outside of the Connecticut Valley and the kind of the central area of Vermont, where we have a lot of hilly topography, we have soils that contain a fragipan or a really dense layer at about a 20 to 30 inch depth. If you have Cabot soils or Peru soils or Versher soils, you have this fragipan in your soils, and this functions to really on hillsides adjacent to growing areas. Water will infiltrate in the upper soils and then hit this dense layer on that hillside, travel down slope, and then reemerge at the toe of the slope, often right in the growing area. And that can create a lot of problems. But it's somewhat easy to address with an interceptor drain. And this would just be either a swell or an excavated ditch, or a excavated ditch backfilled with gravel where you have that slope transition from the hillside to the flatter soil, so that you're intercepting all that subsurface water that's flowing on that dense layer, that fragipan layer, and cutting it off before it can affect your beds in your growing area. And this one is a big bang for the buck. I see a lot of farms where this has been successful, and where it's expected to work really well because they have these exact soils. All right, and then this is my last slide. Just put this in for fun. If you're really interested in drainage and you're looking for a place to take a vacation, you can go to Geneva, New York, and stop by the Drain Tile Museum over there. Although I did hear that this is currently closed due to funding concerns, but there's a picture from inside the tile museum. This is where the first tile drainage was installed in America over 200 years ago by John Johnston, who immigrated here from Scotland. Okay, and I'll stop there, and hopefully we still have, it looks like we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Super, Joshua. Thank you. I guess the Tile Museum is another thing to get riled up about, but do folks have questions they want to just say out loud or put in the chat? I had one quick one while we were waiting, while other people are thinking, wondering like what the lifespan of tile drains are. I think you mentioned this, but has anyone explored non-plastic alternatives? Especially on a smaller scale.
Great question. Yeah, I mean, tile used to not be plastic. Yeah, that's and there is still a company in Ohio that makes a clay tile. And I looked into that for someone this past year. I don't know what the cost would be to ship those. They're short sections. They're like, I want to say maybe 18 inches, something like that. And they come on pallets, and you put them together. You dig the trench and you put them together. And they will work for decades, if not over 100 years, just like plastic tile will. The longevity is not a concern unless there is that sediment that makes it into the tile, or if it passes through a wooded riparian area where you have deep tree roots, those roots can get into a tile line and eventually clog it up. You can have like groundhogs sometimes can get in it and temporarily clog it, but that also might lead to sediment backing up behind that clog. So as long as they don't become clogged, they'll function a long time.
Great. Thank you. Whoops. There's a question. I think Elizabeth is asking if you have any information on possible sources of funding for drainage.
I don't know. NRCS and the conservation districts used to do this, used to fund tile. They don't anymore. I have heard of, at least in Vermont, but I have heard of interest in this from NRCS in Massachusetts. So it's possible it could be a state by state thing. I think there's some differences in how these different programs are implemented in different states, but in Vermont, I'm not aware of anybody supporting that, and that's primarily because of those potential environmental concerns. We just don't know yet what the net effect is from tile drainage.
Hey, Joshua, this is
ahead.
Vern. Thanks for a great talk. One thing that's a little unique with high tunnels, especially with winter growing, is sometimes the ground is frozen. So even if the soil could drain, the water that's on top melting off the tunnels can't go anywhere. And I've seen gravel drainage pits on the outside of tunnels, and I've actually seen one farm did them on the inside to address the issue of to catch the water that's melting on the outside on the surface and running into the tunnel. Have you seen that system, and any thoughts about doing it on the inside of the edge of the tunnel versus the outside?
No, I haven't seen that. That's really interesting. Off the top of my head, I can't think why it would be a problem at all. I think you'd probably get, you might stand the chance of filling your gravel drain up quicker if it's on the outside. I'm just thinking there might be more water on the outside, but I can't think of any immediate concerns with that. That's interesting. No.
And that was about a decade ago, and it was funded by NRCS at the time as part of a high tunnel system. I don't know if they're still doing that, because the environmental concerns would be a lot different for that versus field tile.
Yeah, you're right there, right? And I think I don't want to say that NRCS would not fund one of these roof trench drain type systems because it's clean water. Yeah, I think that's a different situation than tile drains in them. The other thing that made me think of is I don't fully know the impact of this, but I think about it a lot, and I've seen some issues is, when we use the tarping systems, I think we create a lot of impervious soil, and it's just good to be aware of like what's downslope of that, or we have the purpose with the tarping, but then are there, unintended effects downslope of that tarped area? So just something kind of to consider and think about. That I don't fully know what the effect is, but it's something I watch for and I'm very curious about.
Can I ask, I don't want to cut anybody. It's okay to ask something? I have one of those trenches running, bisecting my property that I can't get around. I have to go around. And I heard it used to be a tile drain that collapsed like in the 50s. Is there any environmental implications if I tried to convert that to a tile again so I could get across it? I'm curious. Do you know what I'm asking?
So are you asking, are there any like regulatory concerns around?
Yeah, like something that used to be a tile drain, and then I think in the 70s, it collapsed and the state just dug it out. So it's just like a ditch, like a big ditch.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so like converting it back to a tile so that I can drive over it and maybe make it a bigger, one plot. Are there any concerns about doing that, or is it kind of the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I would hesitate to say for sure. I mean, if it's something the state did, and if it's could be considered like a stream or, you know, flowing waters, I would be hesitant to cover it back up. It might be a case by case, but something you want to have someone come and take a look at before you did anything, and then regret doing that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Josh. Thanks for all the info. Just a quick question. We have a really high water table at our place, and I think it's due to just high bedrock. The ledge is pretty close to the surface. And so one thing I've been trying to wrap my head around is if we install drainage in certain areas, I would think daylighting it would be an issue just because of the depth. And so I was wondering if you've seen anything, any like different kinds of systems for trenches or trying to get water out of the field without any depth of soil.
Yeah. Thanks for, yeah, that's something I didn't mention. Really, so I'll say quickly before I answer the question is like, whenever you're doing a drainage system, you have to start with the outlet. You have to make sure you have an adequate outlet that will go to daylight. And that's where you have to start with any drainage system. That's really important to say. So thanks for the reminder on that. Yeah, I mean, shallow systems, I mean, shallow swells, shallow surface ditches is really what I would kind of go to in that type of situation, Ryan. It may be, you know, maybe, I mean, I'm glad to come out and take a look too, if you want to try to do that at some point. And we can brainstorm on what a solution might be, but I think maybe surface drainage, which is just ditching and swales, might be the right approach. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks. I'll send you an email and maybe we can together.
Great.
I guess I was curious, Joshua, how is there a minimum slope or gradient required in a field to make tile drainage effective?
There isn't, so not for the field itself, but for the tile line itself. If you kind of think about, you know, if the field's flat, the tile then is buried, but it has to have some slope to it. I can check the information. I can check my kind of standards for you. There is a minimum percentage slope, and it's, if you can't, and it's really designed to help move sediment. You know, if you have a really flat tile, then you'll get sediment dropping out of your water and clogging your tile. And there's a couple ways to address that. One is you increase the slope if that's at all possible. And two, you can use a double wall pipe, which has a smooth, like these perforated pipe are corrugated inside as they are outside. And you can use a double wall pipe, which is smooth on the inside, and that will help water move faster and keep sediment moving. It is more expensive, as you might imagine. You know, it has this kind of more material. Sometimes it's really tough to get the slope you need on flat fields that have a really long run, you know, because you can imagine you'd have to start, you start at one end of the field with a slope on your tile, you'd be really deep at the other end of the field if it's one of these fields that's like a quarter mile long or something. So that's where you have challenges with that, and you might want to look into double wall pipe, but there are some recommended slopes.
Great, thank you. Anyone else before we wrap up? It's just about 1 o'clock. Well, thank you so much, Joshua. It's a tremendous amount of great information, and I'm glad we have it recorded so we can all go back and learn the details. And next week we have living mulches and interseeding. So back to some soil and cover crop information. So looking forward to seeing you all next time. And thanks so much, Joshua. I really appreciate your time and knowledge.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.